The wind howled through the narrow streets, sending dry leaves tumbling across the cracked pavement. James pulled his thin jacket tighter around his shoulders, his breath forming small clouds in the cold evening air. His shift at the warehouse had ended hours ago, but instead of heading home, he had spent the last hour pacing outside a convenience store, staring at his nearly empty wallet. $5. That was all he had left. Not enough to buy the groceries his little girl needed. Not enough to fill her stomach tonight, he sighed, rubbing his tired eyes. His hands were calloused from years of hard work. Yet no matter how many hours he clocked in, it never seemed to be enough. Bills piled up. Rent was overdue. His daughter Emily had outgrown her shoes, and the thought of her walking to school with cold feet made his heart ache. As he turned to leave, resigned to another night of skipping dinner so Emily could eat, a frail voice caught his attention. "Excuse me, young man," an elderly woman called, struggling with a cart overloaded with grocery bags. The wind had knocked one over, sending a can rolling onto the sidewalk. James hesitated. He was exhausted. His feet ached, and all he wanted was to collapse into bed. But something in the woman's eyes stopped him. They were kind, yet weary, as if she had seen too many winters pass her by. He stepped forward, bending down to retrieve the can, before it rolled into the street. "Here, ma'am," he said, handing it back to her. Her face lit up with a warm smile. "Oh, thank you, dear. These old hands aren't what they used to be." James nodded, noticing the deep wrinkles on her fingers as she gripped the handle of her cart. The bags were heavy, too heavy for someone her age. Without another thought, he took hold of the cart. "Let me help you with these." The woman's smile widened. "That's very kind of you. My house is just a few blocks away." A few blocks. James could feel the cold creeping into his bones, but he forced a smile. "No problem. Lead the way." As they walked, the woman chatted about the weather, her late husband, and how the neighborhood had changed over the years. James listened, nodding occasionally, but his mind drifted back to his problems. His daughter, the bills, the uncertainty of tomorrow. By the time they reached her house, a modest yet well-kept home with a white picket fence, James was shivering. He set the bags down by the door, rubbing his hands together for warmth. "You're a good man," the woman said, looking at him thoughtfully. "What's your name, dear?" "James," he replied. "James Carter." She nodded, as if memorizing it. "Well, James, I don't have much to offer, but..." She rummaged through her purse and pulled out a small bill. "Take this. Buy something nice for yourself." James glanced at the money. $20. It was more than he had to his name at the moment, but taking money from an elderly woman felt wrong. He shook his head. "I appreciate it, but I can't take this." She frowned. "You have a family, don't you?" James hesitated, then nodded. "Then, take it," she insisted, pressing the bill into his palm. "You did a good thing today. Let someone do something for you in return." Reluctantly, he accepted, mumbling a soft thank you. He turned to leave, but before he could take a step, she spoke again. "Wait." Her voice was softer now, almost hesitant. "James, are you struggling?" Something about her tone made his chest tighten. He wanted to lie, to say everything was fine, but the truth weighed too heavily on him. Yeah, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm trying, but it's hard." The woman studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she simply said, "Come inside for a moment." James hesitated. It was late and he needed to get home, but something in her gaze made him pause. What he didn't know was that stepping into that house would change his life forever. James hesitated at the doorstep. The old woman stood there, waiting, her warm yet knowing eyes searching his face. He should have declined. He needed to get home. But something about her, maybe the kindness in her voice, or the way she had noticed his struggle, made it impossible to walk away. With a quiet sigh, he stepped inside. The house smelled of cinnamon and old books, a strange but comforting mix. A fireplace crackled in the corner, filling the cozy living room with a soft glow. Framed pictures lined the walls, showing glimpses of a life that once was. A younger version of the woman standing before him, a man in a military uniform, a happy-looking family frozen in time. "Sit," she said, motioning toward a worn-out armchair. James sat, glancing around. It had been a long time since he had been in a home that felt stable. His tiny apartment, with its peeling paint and drafty windows, never felt like this. The woman disappeared into the kitchen, returning. A moment later, with 2 steaming mugs of tea, she set one in front of him before easing into a chair across from him. "I never asked your name," he said, wrapping his cold hands around the cup. She smiled. "Margaret." James nodded, taking a sip. The warmth spread through him, easing some of the tension in his chest. "So, James," she said, studying him carefully. "Tell me about your family." He hesitated, unsure why she cared. But something about Margaret felt safe. Like talking to her wouldn't cost him anything. So, he told her. He told her about Emily, his 6-year-old daughter, about his wife, who had passed away when Emily was just a baby. He spoke about the endless struggle, how no matter how hard he worked, he was always one step away from losing everything. Margaret listened, nodding now and then, her fingers tapping against the armrest of her chair. When he finished, silence settled between them. "Life hasn't been kind to you," she said finally. James let out a bitter chuckle. "You could say that," she sighed, as if remembering something distant, something painful. "You remind me of someone." James looked up. "Who?" "My husband," she said softly. "Arthur." She glanced at one of the photos on the wall, a black and white picture of a young couple, their hands intertwined. "He came from nothing," Margaret continued, "worked himself to the bone to make a life for us. We struggled, just like you. There were nights we went to bed hungry, wondering if things would ever get better." James listened, intrigued. "But he never gave up," she said, her eyes distant. "And eventually life rewarded him." James nodded, though he wasn't sure life had any rewards left for him. Margaret leaned forward. "You helped me tonight, even when you had nothing to give. That says something about you, James." He didn't know what to say to that. Then, unexpectedly, she asked, "Are you happy?" James swallowed hard. It was a simple question, but one he hadn't allowed himself to think about. "No," he admitted, "but I can't afford to be anything else." Margaret nodded, as if she understood more. Then she led on. The room fell quiet, the fire crackling softly in the background. After a moment, she stood. "Wait here." James watched as she disappeared down the hall, her footsteps barely making a sound. When she returned, she was holding a small envelope. She placed it on the table between them. "Open it." James frowned but reached for it. When he pulled out the contents, his breath caught in his throat. Inside was a check with more zeros than he had ever seen in his life. His hands trembled. I can't take this." Margaret smiled, but there was something serious in her expression. "I don't think you understand, James. This isn't charity." He looked at her, confused. "I've been looking for someone like you," she said. "Someone who understands struggle. Someone who still chooses kindness, despite it." James shook his head, still in disbelief. "But why?" Margaret took a deep breath. "Because I know what it's like to need a second chance. And I have the power to give one." His heart pounded in his chest. Was this real? Could his life really change just like that? But before he could say another word, Margaret leaned forward and said something that sent chills down his spine. I have a proposition for you, James, but it comes with a choice. James stared at her, his mind racing, and in that moment, he knew his life would never be the same again. James sat frozen, the weight of Margaret's words pressing down on him. A choice. He glanced at the check again, his hands still trembling. The amount was more than he had ever seen in his life, more than enough to clear his debts, move into a better home, and give Emily the life she deserved. But why him? Why now? Margaret watched him carefully, her expression unreadable. I've spent years wondering what to do with what I have, she said softly. I don't have children. No family left. Just wealth that means nothing if it doesn't serve a purpose. James swallowed hard. And you think I'm that purpose? She smiled faintly. I think you're someone who won't take it for granted. But there's something I need from you first. His heart pounded. What is it? Margaret took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the armrest of her chair. I want you to promise me that if I help you, you'll help others in return. That when you find someone who needs a hand the way you did tonight, you won't turn away. James looked at her, stunned. That was it. No conditions, no repayment, just a promise to keep the kindness going. His throat felt tight as he thought about all the times he had wished for someone to see his struggle, for someone to care. Now, here she was, offering him everything he had ever needed, not because he asked, but because he had helped her without expecting anything in return. Slowly he nodded. I promise. Margaret's face softened. Then it settled. James exhaled sharply, still trying to process everything. I don't even know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Margaret said, standing up. Just do good with it. James stood too, the check still in his hands, his mind spinning. He had walked into this house as a struggling father, a man on the verge of breaking. And now his entire life had changed, in a way he never could have imagined. As he reached the door, he turned back to her. Thank you, Margaret. I won't forget this, she smiled. I know you won't. James stepped out into the cold night, but somehow it didn't feel so cold anymore. He looked up at the sky, the stars blinking above him, and for the first time in years, he felt something he had nearly forgotten: hope. And as he walked home to his daughter, he knew one thing for certain: this was only the beginning.